This is the fifth webinar in our series, fifth and final webinar in our series. And today we'll be focusing on what we heard throughout the series session. And I'll do a bit more of an intro to this session. But first we're going to go to Elder Verna from Kitigan-Zibi Anishinaabe to do our opening.
Big wetch, Andrea. I just lit another smudge here. I'm in the lobby, by the way, of the Shadow Logan in Maniwaki, and I was telling Andrea and those online before is that I'm at a meeting today on the American eel, the Pimisi, which was very abundant in the Ottawa River watershed, the St. Lawrence, but also too as well a big swath of the eastern coast because they migrate to the Sargasso Sea. And as I mentioned before, on contact too as well, the part of that process, yes, there was the timber extraction where we see the biggest timber extraction in the world really is the northeast of Turtle Island on the east here. And with that followed the need for electricity. Like today, even now, with all this talk of electric cars, even AI, they're starting this nuclear plant, 3 Mile Island, to power AI. And I was thinking, oh, wow, that's kind of interesting. But going back to the eel, where there was 52 dams now erected on the Ottawa River watershed, and it wiped out basically the American eel in the watershed. And so they migrate to the east. And even last spring, or this past spring, they had to close the Elver, those are the baby eels, fishery too, and had to clamp down on the poaching of these Elvers because they're in high demand for the Asian market. And what they do in Asia is that if when they're caught, the male eels or the eels, the baby eels, if they're left in a confined smaller space, they turn into males. So once they hit Asia, they're given a bigger space, and the females also produce the eggs. So anyway, so it's in such demand in Asia because of the sushi. But so it created a black market for the Elvers. So again, to how does this tie to impact assessment too as well? It's looking at that impact, and why I'm saying this today too, because I just came out from this meeting, and there was a young person talking, and they asked him, "What do you think about now after listening to the presentation about these eels?" He said, and I found that disheartening. He said, I think it's too late for my kids. As a young person concerned, it's concerning that it might be too late for me as well. He goes, if it wasn't for my grandfather teaching me the importance of this fish and how to take only what you need and how sacred it is, he goes, but now that species may be depleted as it has been depleted. That's why I think this now, this talk and sharing communication here is so important, because once these species are gone, what happens to when there's talk about this deglobalization, and there's talk about that we may have to go back because of not the population decline in other countries, here in Canada as well, a global population decline, that we will see a decline in a lot of the products we take for granted, especially also the food source. And what happens when you have to depend on a local food source, but now they're gone, like possibly the eel or the salmon, or there's such a low population, and worse so CO2 as well. They're contaminated. So that's why I was thinking about this impact assessment, and asking hard questions is so important. So on that note, I say, bigwach ojeni gashkito chamo se konshe nongo mwame kakina pamad sajik shwen mishnonin abigis we do kwa kakina denis wa konshe che manchit non when kagige migwach oje kakina gagishan dano she mam de gain de kimanon ni bi manon ishkude na seven kakina guch we do kwa kakina pamad sajik Mino Pamazwaj, Chinagado Abadan, Kakinaguch, Ninjino and Daganak, Kakinaguch, Nea, Awensi Sap, Pemiswajik, Pamadagajik, Pamudagajik, Ashich, Neogadajik, Mam de Gay, Mijimwajik. We do kwa Kakina, Ninjino and Daganak, Ashich, Negokmasnan, Mishom Sanan, Ashich, Nindodinizon, She Nongomonje, Nidabano Jishak, Nibashkadagma, Kamashed, and this work, Ashich. Kan se squat ning gwede simen kego gejemane do shich kana noch kuch ning gwede simen we do kwa kakina mi miigwach. Yeah, miigwach. I say, for those of you who are on here for the first time, I say miigwach, which is thank you, say merci en algonquin. I say it 4 times to honor the 4 directions, the 4 seasons, the 4 colors of people on this planet, and the 4 elements: the earth, the water, the air, the fire, because they without the 4 elements too, we wouldn't be here. And what the elders say is we come from really the stars. We're all stars here, and I want you to be a star today too. And we take our earth journey. So we come from the land and we return back to the land. And as we're in human spirit form, I honor you and I hope that you do a good job in being a caretaker, because one of our creation stories too as well is that all 4 colors of people, regardless of our skin color, were given the original instructions to be caretakers of the earth and in all creation, really. So impact assessment is part of that. So I wish you a good meeting, and I may have to apologize. I'm going to log off for a little while because I have to go listen to some of the elders, but I will be coming back. So talk and ask good questions. Miigwech. Back to you, Andrea.
Miigwech, Elder Verda. Thank you so much. Thanks for being with us throughout the series as well. We appreciate your guidance.
Oh, miigwech. And raise hell. No. Cause trouble. Cause good
Always.
trouble.
There we go.
Okay.
Always.
All right.
Welcome, everyone. So my name is Andrea Lesperance. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Assembly of First Nations Environment Sector. This is our impact assessment webinar series, session number 5. So far, we've had 4 other sessions in this series. The first was an introduction. The next 3 were subject matter specific, and then today is the what we heard session. Just a few housekeeping items, and then we'll kind of do an overview of what I'm hoping to achieve in this session. So the session will be recorded in the plenary session. We are hoping to do some breakout rooms, and those will not be recorded. So those could be considered your in-camera sessions. If there's anything that you'd like to reserve saying until an in-camera session, the breakout room would be the place to do it. But everything in the plenary will be recorded, and the recordings have been shared with anyone who wanted to attend the session but couldn't, or wanted to use them for note-taking purposes as well. There is translation available. Again, the translation will be available in the main plenary, which is where we will spend most of our time today. When we go to breakouts, we do have the option for a French breakout room. And so at that time, we'll just ask anyone who would like to communicate primarily in French to indicate, and we can facilitate that. There is also closed captioning available, and the link is in the chat now. So if you wanted to use the closed captioning service, that's available. One of the great things with the closed captioning service use as well is that it has generated transcripts. And so in addition to the recordings, once we're done the session, I can circulate those as well. The chat is enabled, and throughout the session, just encourage folks to either raise your hand if you wanted to speak to anything or put them in the chat. Hope we could have people kind of come on video and unmute more today than we have in the last few sessions, but you're still more than welcome to use the chat if that's how you prefer to share your recommendations. All the materials, including the agenda and the presentation that I'll walk through today, are on our microsite, where we've been hosting all of the other information as well. So I'm just going to put the link in the chat to the microsite right now, and can also link to the agenda as well. So for today, what I'm proposing to do is to facilitate more of a space for participants to workshop recommendations aimed at the proposals that the agency and the circle of experts in the case of the co-administration piece have proposed. So the Impact Assessment Agency has released a 5-year review of the project list discussion paper, a discussion paper on Indigenous co-administration of federal impact assessment, as well as the ministerial exclusion orders, the list of projects that wouldn't require environmental assessment. I guess it's called an environmental review process on reserve and other federal lands. I see someone has their hand up. It's an AFN tech person. Was there a tech issue that we needed to address, or is that a legacy hand? Okay, I don't hear anyone speaking to it, so I'll just ask our IT folks if there's something that needs to be addressed. Maybe just send me a message in the chat or in the Teams, and I'll just proceed for now. So so there's a few kind of engagement pieces that have been put out by the Impact Assessment Agency. Our session on September 3rd covered the project list 5-year review, and the project list is that regulation that sets out what classes of projects and of what size automatically require a federal impact assessment. Our session on September 10th covered the ministerial exclusion order, and the one last week on the 17th covered Indigenous co-administration of federal impact assessment. And so hoping today that instead of doing more of the kind of presentation and sharing of information, we can facilitate a space for participants to brainstorm and workshop some of the recommendations that you think that either AFN should be making in technical submissions or that you would like to submit unilaterally, but just hoping to kind of facilitate more of a dialogue between participants. And so I'll make my way kind of through some of the information on what we heard and what participants had shared, but also would just encourage you as much as you can or would like to turn your video on and unmute and let us know if there's additional recommendations that can and should be captured. And towards the end of our session, we can go into some breakout groups as well to hopefully facilitate more of that dialogue and kind of put pen to paper on some recommendations that can and should be made in response to the kind of engagement initiatives that are ongoing. So I think with that, I'm going to put the link to the presentation for today in the chat, and I'll open it and share my screen. And I'm actually going to share my screen so you can see the notes. because I'm going to use those notes throughout. So just give me 1 second. Okay. Gerben, I see you at the top of my screen. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see this presentation? Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to work my way through the presentation. I'm going to do my best to summarize information that we've heard from our colleagues from the Impact Assessment Agency and folks that were on the line through the session. And if there's anything that you wanted to kind of add as something maybe you thought of after the session, but you would like captured in any of the submissions that folks are making, please feel free to just raise your hand and I can call on folks and facilitate that as well. So, So we'll just start with a review. In each of the sessions, we had talked about AFN's mandate on impact assessment. And I'll just recall that the resolutions that give us our mandate to work on impact assessment policy do come from 2018, 2019, during the time where the Impact Assessment Act itself was being developed and First Nations had overwhelmingly participated in the legislative process to make recommendations for what the Impact Assessment Act itself should cover and enable and require. And so I'll just note for folks too, I do think that, so it's been 5 years since the act was adopted. I do think that there is a need or perhaps an opportunity to put forward some recommendations for a new mandate. Our mandate had been to conduct information sessions like this one to support policy development. But I think that throughout the webinars and other discussions that we've had, there is an opportunity to call for enhanced focus on supporting First Nations-led assessment, in addition to ensuring that assessments led by the agency or panels properly partner with and consult with First Nations. So I think one of the things that we could suggest is a updated mandate, and would be really happy to work with anyone here offline if you have recommendations for things that you think can and should be covered in a resolution, or any of your leadership is interested in kind of providing guidance to updated mandates for AFN, please feel free to reach out to me and I'd be happy to facilitate that as well. So in the development of the Impact Assessment Act, nations did participate in the legislative process. There was an expert panel on environmental law that made recommendations on that kind of helped to guide the development of the Impact Assessment Act. It entered into force in August 2019. It replaced the previous Canadian Environmental Assessment Act from 2012. And as we know, the Impact Assessment Agency is the main authority. The key kind of First Nations provisions were the mandatory consideration of the impacts of a project on Indigenous rights as part of the assessment and at the decision-making stage. The mandatory consideration of Indigenous knowledge in the impact assessment, recognition of Indigenous governing bodies as jurisdictions and new opportunities for Indigenous-led assessments. Kind of two streams, I think are the Indigenous co-administration agreements and the section of the Act that enables those, but also the section that requires that any First Nations-led assessment be considered in the impact assessment and therefore the minister's decision-making as well. A prohibition on designated projects proceeding without approval from the minister if they will have effect on Indigenous rights, and also the mandatory establishment of an Indigenous Advisory Committee and the circle of experts that co-developed the discussion paper on Indigenous co-administration is a subgroup of the Indigenous Advisory Committee, and we had two folks from the circle of experts co-present with the agency last week. So we had a bit of a discussion in the first webinar session on recent amendments to the Impact Assessment Act. The Supreme Court had released a decision that said that the Impact Assessment Act and the project list regulations were unconstitutional because they went outside the bounds of federal jurisdiction. And so the agency put together a package of amendments and did engagement with Indigenous organizations, including AFN, to get feedback on the amendments. I don't think that the package of amendments was substantially changed during that engagement process. And the Budget Implementation Act is the piece of the bill that contained the amendments. It was passed following study by the House Finance Committee and a pre-study by the Senate Environment Committee. AFN, Regional Chief Kluani Adamek, who is the environment portfolio holder at AFN, appeared at the Senate Committee and spoke to AFN's recommendations on amendments. The outcome of that was that the committee itself adopted in their report what's called an observation that called on the Government of Canada to ensure that one specific amendment on increasing substitution wasn't going to impede Indigenous rights. We haven't seen any response back from government, but if something exists that I'm not aware of, and other folks do, maybe you can send it. I'm seeing Carolyn put in the chat, as someone from territory now known as Alberta, I apologize for a crazy ideologically driven premier and government and their stupid reference to the court. Thanks for that, Carolyn. And to just note for folks too that the Supreme Court reference case was initiated by the government of Alberta, but it also was supported by other provinces. I think, I don't know the exact number, but there were a lot of provinces that intervened in support of Alberta's position that the act was unconstitutional, as well as some First Nations and First Nations organizations as well. AFN didn't intervene in the reference case itself, but we were just observing that there were First Nations that intervened on either side of the constitutional question. So it's interesting to note that as well. In the webinars, we did hear that, so one of the amendments that was adopted is a reference to non-negligible effects. And it's one of the things that we had raised in the submission to the Senate committee as well, that any kind of categorization or classification of impacts, particularly to First Nations rights, shouldn't be kind of deemed non-negligible, that any impact to rights is I was about to say negligible, that's not right, are important. Any potential impact to rights are important. They can't be categorized as negligible, particularly given like the colonial history, and that anything that potentially impacts rights is on top of a whole history of for relationships with First Nations that have impacted the ability to exercise rights. And so any additional kind of factors can't be dismissed at this point. That's not acceptable and never was. So we did hear from folks on the first webinar concern about that language of like negligible impacts. And so the recommendation I think that we'll continue to put forward is that First Nations must be involved in and agree with any categorization of impacts to rights, even if it's those initial kind of screening related decisions. The other thing that we heard, like folks noted and asked about in that first webinar was the ability to initiate regional assessments. During the time after the point where the Supreme Court had issued its opinion saying that the act was constitutional, a lot of the unconstitutional, a lot of the activities were suspended, including requests for designation. The agency felt that they couldn't do certain things without kind of a functioning act. And so a lot of those activities were like re-engaged following the amendments being adopted. And so now the agency can kind of re-engage with its regional assessments. And there were no amendments to the regional assessment provisions in the amendment process following the Supreme Court's decision. I'm just going to pause and take a drink of my coffee. Was there anything anyone else wanted to say about the amendments? Please feel free. This like we would really like to be able to kind of workshop recommendations for ongoing advocacy. And I mean, it works best when folks are able to engage. So if you wanted to raise your hand or just unmute and start talking and or put anything into the chat that you wanted to add. But I can move on to the alignment with the UN Declaration, if not. So I think one of the pieces to consider going forward is how the Impact Assessment Act itself aligns with the government's commitments to implementing UNDRIP. And also how impact assessments are being done procedurally as well as substantively align with the minimum standards articulated in UNDRIP. We'll note that the Impact Assessment Act referenced in the preamble UNDRIP and the Government of Canada's commitment to implement UNDRIP, but that the Impact Assessment Act itself came into force before the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, and the UNDRIP Act has been adopted since then. We do know that the UNDA action plan was also released. And in that action plan, the Government of Canada committed to develop mandatory assessment tools to determine if new or changes to laws and regulations are consistent with the UN Declaration. As far as we know, those mandatory assessment tools have not yet been adopted. During the process of amending the act, we had asked the agency if they had done an assessment of whether the amendments were in line with UNDRIP. They had said that that was an analysis that had been undertaken internally, but there wasn't anything made public, and there wasn't anything that First Nations were asked to comment on or provide input to. And so I think one of the important points is that when a piece of legislation, including the Impact Assessment Act, is amended, or a new piece of legislation is proposed, there needs to be an assessment tool that is public facing to provide accountability, but also that First Nations can provide feedback on and say that they agree with or disagree with. Otherwise, it's not necessarily particularly useful to do those analyses as internal exercises that just kind of allow government departments to kind of self-assess whether they think they're in line with the requirements articulated in UNDRIP and the Act itself. Specifically, Action Plan Measure 51 in the UND Action Plan committed the agency to implement the Impact Assessment Act in a way that aligns with the UN Declaration and lists certain means of doing so. That list, I'll read it because I think it is important to see what the government has committed themselves to doing. So carrying out impact assessments. Actually, you know what? I'm going to put it in the chat. This is Action Plan Measure 51 from, oh, my message is too long. Please try sending multiple shorter messages. Okay. Well, let's try this. So this is the list. So the Government of Canada has committed itself to implementing the Impact Assessment Act by carrying out impact assessments in a manner that emphasizes the need to seek free, prior, and informed consent, maximize Indigenous collaboration and partnership, including the advancement of regulations to enable Indigenous cooperation agreements, early, consistent, and meaningful engagement and partnership through all phases of impact assessment, respect for Indigenous rights, culture, and jurisdiction, mandatory consideration of Indigenous knowledge, continually building Crown Indigenous relations, supporting Indigenous capacity and impact assessment, consideration of health, social, economic factors, including impacts to women, youth, and elders, consideration of any cumulative effects that are likely to result from a designated project, in combination with other physical activities that have been or will be carried out. I don't know the exact page number, but in the UNDA Action Plan, that is Action Plan Measure 51. So we do know that even though the agency has taken the position that the Impact Assessment Act itself is already in line with UNDRIP and the UNDRIP Act, First Nations have disagreed. In particular, we have put forward suggestion that there's 3 key inconsistencies with the UN Declaration. So it's inconsistent with Article 26. I should have put the text here. But the IAA fails to give legal recognition and protection to First Nations lands, territories, and resources in accordance with the laws, customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of First Nations. Article 32, the Act does not require free, prior, or informed consent of impacted First Nations in order for the Government of Canada to approve a project. And Article 37, so the Impact Assessment Act provides mechanisms for cooperation and shared decision-making, but fails to effectively implement those powers and shared decision-making with First Nations, including in treaty territories. Kim asked if I could put the articles up. Yes, I can. Let me just open. So I'm going to split screen here. You should be able to see. Gerben, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the UNDRIP PDF and my slides? Okay, good. Okay, so Article 26. Let's see if I can copy it into the chat. Okay, so Article 26, I just put into the chat. Indigenous peoples have the right to the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. Number two, Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources that they possess by reason of traditional ownership or other traditional occupation or use, as well as those which they have otherwise acquired. States shall give legal recognition and protection to those lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the Indigenous peoples concerned. And so we've identified that the Impact Assessment Act is not consistent with this article because it doesn't give legal recognition and protection to First Nations lands, territories, and resources in accordance with their laws, customs, traditions, and land tenure systems. So I'm going to go now to Article 32. And I'll note for folks too, like if you were looking to put together like a technical submission on the project list in particular, I do think that these articles and the kind of inconsistencies that are raised are particularly useful to mention in any kind of advocacy tool that's directed towards policy making, because it's important to continue to raise these inconsistencies. So Article 32, I'll copy this into the chat as well, if it'll allow me. So Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development and use of their lands or territories and other resources. States shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples concerned institutions in order to obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands or territories and other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploration of mineral, water, or other resources. And states shall provide effective mechanisms for just and fair redress for any activities, and appropriate measures shall be taken to mitigate adverse environmental, economic, social, cultural, or spiritual impacts. So we've identified that the Impact Assessment Act is inconsistent with this Article 32 because it does not require free, prior, or informed consent of impacted First Nations in order for the Government of Canada to approve a project. So finally, I'll just go down to Article 37, and I'll copy this into the chat for folks as well. So Indigenous peoples have the right to the recognition, observance, and enforcement of treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements concluded with states or their successors, and to have states honor and respect such treaties, agreements, or other constructive arrangements. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as diminishing or eliminating the rights of Indigenous peoples contained in treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements. So we've identified that the Impact Assessment Act is inconsistent with Article 37 because while it does provide mechanisms for cooperation and just shared decision making, it fails to effectively implement those powers and share decision making with First Nations, including in treaty territories. So if there are folks on the line here who are like putting together technical submissions and wanted to include the points that we've raised, I think that's important to kind of continue to bring up in any documents that are being submitted to the agency for policy proposals, those inconsistencies. So we have put together some draft recommendations. One is, and these are like open for feedback for anyone on the line. A call for the Impact Assessment Act. A call for an amendment to the Impact Assessment Act to recognize First Nations jurisdiction and decision-making authority. And I believe that well, I know that we had made this recommendation in our technical submission to the Senate committee when it was studying the Budget Implementation Act that contained the amendments. And I think the point that had been raised at that time was that, well, the act itself enables the negotiation of co-administration agreements. There could be more done to ensure that there's a recognition of First Nations jurisdiction in the act itself, and also just provide more certainty about the role of Indigenous governing bodies as in decision making under the act as well. One of the ones that we've already talked about is demanding a mandatory public assessment tool for alignment with the UNDA. And again, that's a suggestion that we had made in our submission to the Senate Standing Committee on Environment regarding during the amendment process. Um, the last one here is to call on the government of Canada to fund First Nations-led analysis of alignment with UNDA. I do know that there's been a lot of discussion among First Nations about why the impact assessment regime isn't upholding those minimum standards articulated in the declaration. I think the most important one being the requirement for consultation towards consent and consensus building. And so it's not necessarily appropriate at this point for the agency to take the position that no, the act is consistent, and so we don't necessarily need to do anything further. There's been a scholarship from academics that have raised specific issue with why impact assessment is inconsistent, as well as other models to look to as well. So I know in the BC context, their environmental assessment legislation requires at least an effort towards consensus building. And I think it's important to learn from examples like that where something else has been done. And so hoping that if there's anyone on the line who wants to share about experiences with that process, eager to hear those as well. I'm wondering if there's anyone on the call who have kind of additional recommendations that they'd like to put forward to to advise, I suppose, that we could include in any of our technical submissions on how to progress on UNDRIP implementation in the impact assessment realm. Is there anyone who wanted to speak about kind of the alignment of impact assessment requirements and minimum standards articulated in UNDRIP?
I would love to say something. It's Kim Harvey.
Sure, that's
I'm from
great.
the Robinson Superior Treaties, which we were still in negotiations with a lot of things for the past annuities. I have been traveling around our lovely country to numerous reserves with regards to settlements for land. I've had the opportunity and the good fortune to take a look at many, many, many of each and every reserve settlement papers, including my own. And there's their nice little wording in there that on each and every one of these with regards to past, present, and future, going after the government, the municipalities, the townships, any of the energy sectors. So what that means is we can't go back at any point in time with regards to these, what's happening. Like these land settlements have to do with everything with regards to the lands and the minerals and what's about to be getting ripped out of the ground. And I have worked in the oil gas pipeline industry, and I have had the fortunate opportunities to work with some of the best people across the world with regards to the bad impacts, what's about to take place all over, not just in Ontario right now with that lithium and the nuclear damage. This is all across Canada. People, but our people, it's up to us. We have to take care of Mother Earth and these minerals and how nuclear, all this stuff is with regards to nuclear. And this is very imperative. The water, they're going to be draining the water beds like crazy everywhere. And them putting that nice little word, that I don't know if how many of you understand or have been noticing on the government side, they're put a bill on hold right now, which is called Bill C-38. And that's going to affect each and every Canadian person in Canada, that once that bill is put in, that not even the Canadian people can go after these people. So once the waters start getting drained, poisoned, the land gets poisoned, the animals get poisoned. So what are we supposed to eat? How are we supposed to go to our natural medicines to heal ourselves when those are poisoned as well and sick? So we're expected to be eating chemicals, man-made chemicals. We need to pay attention to this stuff. This is not, because when they're using those words past, present, and future, who are we supposed to be holding accountable to this? I know for one, I don't want people coming to sue me to say, hey, you're the Indian of Canada here and come from the pre-Confederacy Treaty. That was your job to be making sure that when we were going to start pulling minerals out of the ground, that the people and the lands and the water weren't going to be getting sick. So if we can't go to the band councils and the chiefs to go after them, we can't go after federal or provincial governments. We can't go after these energy sector people and all these mining companies that are coming in like Avalon and everybody from Australia and all over. Who do you think the people are going to come after to say, hey, why are we sick? Why is the water beds drained? Why is the water getting poisoned? How come the animals and the birds are poisoned? How come the medicines are poisoned in the lands? I'm not going to be held accountable for that. And these are things that each and every one of us, as people from the treaties, that's our job and our duty. And this is stuff that has to be brought up to these people. They play around with wording. We know, all of us know, even the Canadian people they are understanding the issues that our people are facing with the government. And we have a responsibility, not just to our own people and our own tribes, but we have a responsibility to each and every Canadian citizen. So how do we make sure that with these impact assessments, because this is all connected, interconnected, we know it's going to happen. We know that our reserves have signed on to this to make jobs and money. But at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that's being overlooked. And this impact assessment is very, very important. Other people may not want to bring it up about what's in those settlement papers, but unfortunately, I'm going to bring it up because it needs to be brought up. This is our lives right now. And you understand, when a week goes by, they can't say, well, hey, you guys made a decision and can't go back a week. We have to start looking from today, and whatever decisions we make today will be the past. Then whatever day it is, it could be 2 months from now, that'll be the present. And when everything is poisoned, that's the future. And I know people in this, I look to see who's in these. I've been in a lot of meetings all over Canada the last 3 years. I have done a lot of traveling to a lot of reserves from one end of Canada to the other to see what's going on. And coming from the pre-Confederacy, before Canada became Canada, we have a duty, all of us, each and every one of us, treaty or non-treaty, non-status or non-status, we have a duty to protect Mother Earth and those waters and the children. Yes, we all need money. We all need jobs. But when it's going to come at a cost, and a big cost, and then everybody's going to be looking at us people as us people as the land, supposed to be the keepers of the land and the keepers of the water, why did we allow this to go through? Members are not being properly informed, and there's people fighting. The members are fighting each and every reserve across Canada right now, that they're not being included in meetings, virtual meetings. They expect people. I know that from my reserve, we have people that are in Australia. So in order to get to a meeting, what do you think, people are millionaires to get on a plane from Australia to get all the way back to Ontario? These are things we all need to be speaking up and forcing, and not just say, well, we're only going to look after my reserve. We need to look after everybody. And that's our duty, each and every one of us. If we continue to keep working on separate levels to say, I'm from this reserve, Treaty 1, pre-Confederacy, Williams Treaty, we're going to get nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. When are we all going to start working together collectively? Because this is not just going to affect one treaty or one specific province or area. If you look at those maps and those minerals and stuff from pre-Confederacy, from the Hudson Bay, and take a look at the minerals, and we know for a fact that poisoning in Canada in the 70s was done. And they knew that Canada holds one of the richest lithium deposits in the world, diamonds as well. People need to understand pulling that diamond, it's not for rings and stuff. They need those diamonds to drill through the friggin' rock. I'm sorry, you know what I mean? I might be at a turn with some people, but unfortunately, the hard truth, it's there. And when I have people that come to me from every culture and race that are in this country and ask me questions, how am I supposed to answer that to people? Never mind our own people. When you try to bring these things up to the chiefs and band councils, 99% of them are worried about a big pocket full of money. How many of you people know that our money from cows and plows and the annuities that chiefs and band councils have been investing into the lithium stock market for many, many, many years, along with the towns and the little communities all around? How many of you on here know that? So you see what we're dealing with? So this is very imperative, this impact assessment. This is affecting all of us. I know I don't want to be poisoned. I know I don't want my grandchildren. I don't want anybody poisoned. And what we're talking about today, next week will be the past. That's why they're trying to tell us, don't go talk to another reserve and tell them what's in your settlement papers. They don't want us sharing that. They want us to fight with each other, stay apart so that the government and Australia and these foreign elected entities can come here. They're not worried about us getting sick. Different story if they said, hey, everybody's going to get sick. Would you like to move somewhere else where you're not going to get sick? But the government doesn't even give us that offer. And I'm not going to be held accountable as an Indian and as somebody from pre-Confederacy treaty that's going to damage Mother Earth, the waters, the lands, the people. My grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, and my grandmothers must be rolling in their grave with absolute sickness at what is going on right now. This is not the way our people worked. Our people worked collectively. If you came from a reserve of 2,000 people, all 2,000 people sat down and talked and made a decision. And this is important, and that's our job and our duty, each and every one of us here. And if we continue doing this to say, well, I only need to worry about my reserve in my province and only in this district, it's not going to work. We're going to continue failing, and the government is going to continue doing what they want, walking all over us and all over the people. I'm sorry if I'm out of turn, but I have to bring these things up because, like I said, I've been traveling around and working in those sectors and learning from people from all across the world right now, and things that my ancestors showed me, maps and things that I was very fortunate enough to have and take a look at from all across Canada. I had family. My family was guides to the Hudson Bay Company across Canada, maps and things. So can you imagine the stories, the things that I was shown about the minerals here in our country? These people aren't worried about us. They're worried about the minerals. Thank you for letting me kind of voice what's needed, but these are things that need to really be discussed.
For sure. No, that's great. My gosh, thank you, Kim. And not out of turn at all. That's what we're hoping to do here is I heard you say that we need to work collectively, and so hoping to facilitate that space today. So thank you for raising those really important points. I saw a hand in the hand raised first, and then there's a question in the chat, but maybe can we go to you, Abraham?
Hi, z tego całego technologia, technologia, ako zasne, nagle, Wagania Tlonos. Hi, my name is Abraham Francis. I'm Deer Clan and Mohawk from Akwesasne, southern, kind of like southern and easternmost point of Ontario. So anyways, what I've been sort of intrigued by is why there's an absence of language from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Calls for Justice. I've seen some language around TRC and UNDRIP, but I think as we talk about the impacts to land and resource development, that we also have to take into consideration the impacts on, or what we found through the MMIW report. And I also really get intrigued, and I think the previous speaker really focused on this piece about the present, or the past, present, and future aspect, and this language that I've heard consistently throughout this process, or I've read in the discussion piece about sort of like these binding agreements into the future, like a decision's been made. And I think that there should be an infrastructure to crack these things open. And maybe it's outside or maybe it's some kind of bigger thing that we're not thinking about. But the reason I think about that is because certain things that were considered to not cause harm later down the road end up causing harm. And just because we made a decision previously to approve them does not exhume us from responsibility to those decisions. And I think about the responsibility of the businesses that are applying for these projects to develop, as well as the government within this process, right? And whenever I think about these aspects of things and how we're evaluating is to make them comprehensive and holistic. There is this Impact Assessment Act, but that there's these ways that you can look at the cumulative impacts and the social impacts and the social determinants of health. And there's certain vulnerabilities that come out of that. But also what I was saying about the past, present, and future is like PFAS was considered a chemical that did not cause harm, but now, we're very well aware of its impacts throughout the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence. And so being able to hold a company accountable in that process is really necessary. And things I've learned in my life is like the incorporations of things like the precautionary principle to have businesses do feasibility studies on these potential impacts. But at the same time, this past, present, and future limitation being something that could be interrogated and broke back open is something that I think is really important. And another sort of like aspect of this is, and I heard this a lot from Tayayage last week, is sort of like this is a step, we're only engaged in this process as far and I think a lot of this work around like harm reduction, because we're not going to find our justice in the Canadian legal framework. The regulations around an impact assessment, or the legalities and the implications around an impact assessment, to me is sort of like getting approval, the permits and approvals to pollute. There's a process in place to like say, yeah, you can pollute up to this point, but there's certain scenarios where like we should be able to interrogate the elements of that. And so that's just kind of a little bit of what this has me thinking about, and really appreciate the opportunity to share. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the really important points as well. I hope it's not distracting that I'm taking notes in the PowerPoint presentation while folks are intervening, making interventions. Just doing my best to kind of capture the really high level points, and then we'll be able to go back to the recordings and make more detailed notes as we go. But thank you for that. Really appreciate your intervention. I see in the chat too, there was a question from Jordan. Does the call on the government of Canada to fund First Nation-led analysis of alignment with the UNDA recommendation relate to project-specific funding or capacity funding as a larger scope, or is it left to be more broad? And can I elaborate a bit more on the mandatory public assessment tool? So with regards to the call to fund a First Nations-led analysis, I think that would be kind of outside of project-specific funding. I do think that there have been like chapters and books and things that have been written about UNDRIP alignment, the Impact Assessment Act alignment with UNDRIP, but none of those as far as I've seen, none of those analysis have been like done by First Nations themselves, like in a community setting. It's been more individual scholarship. And so I do think that there's a need to fund like communities' own analyses of the entirety of the kind of impact assessment requirements. So that I think the recommendation is intended to be outside of any like one project, but more kind of a analysis of the whole impact assessment regime as it interacts with First Nations. The mandatory public assessment tool, so that is, I'll just go back to the action plan. Sorry, so I don't have the exact reference, but it is one of the things that the Government of Canada had committed itself to in its UNDRIP action plan, was to develop a mandatory assessment tool for and regulations, not just the Impact Assessment Act itself. And I think the examples that they had used were like cabinet directives, where there's cabinet directives on other things. I think there's a suggestion that there would be a cabinet directive that requires like the regulatory impact, RIAS, regulatory impact statement. Analysis statement. So regulatory impact analysis statements are required for regulations. So something, I think the suggestion in the UNDRIP action plan was that there would be something like this, where with each piece of legislation, the government had to publish this sort of analysis, like they have to do for regulations, and explain what the intention of the regulation is and what it would do. So I would urge you maybe to go to the UNDA action plan and consider what they have committed themselves to, and see if there's any recommendations that you'd like to make from your community on how, or your organization, on how that could actually work to facilitate dialogue between government and First Nations themselves. If I think in the interest of time, maybe we'll go to the section on First Nations-led assessments, because I do think that this is a really important topic and one that I know a lot of folks are interested in. So there, in the new Impact Assessment Act, there is a requirement that the assessment, and so in the minister's decision making, they have to consider the assessment report. So they would have to consider First Nations-led assessments along with other factors. So kind of the downside is that there's not necessarily any additional weight given to that First Nation-led assessment over, say, the other factors that is required for the assessment, and so the minister to consider. But if a First Nation has done their own assessment, it does have to be one of the things that the minister considers in decision making, which I do see as a positive, that that is a requirement. So but there are circumstances in which First Nations have done their impact assessment, have adopted their own projects and applied it to assessment of a project. And so there, to different, I think, degrees of, let's say, success, but success can be measured in a number of different ways. So that's perhaps not the right word for it. The outstanding issue I think that we've heard is that There's no requirements for government to fund those First Nations-led impact assessments, as well as there's no requirements to like make a final determination about the project on the basis of that assessment and the corresponding decision to provide or withhold free, prior, and informed consent. On the issue of funding, so we've raised this that like if a First Nation wants to conduct their own assessment in accordance with their own laws and customs, traditions, there needs to be a mechanism to fund them adequately. And so the agency has indicated that there is some funding available for what they've called pilot projects for First Nations-led assessments on an ad hoc basis. And I believe at this point that would be through the existing kind of funding portfolios that are available to First Nations. And so what they indicated to us is that if a First Nation is currently being consulted on an impact assessment, they can, and they're interested in conducting their own assessment, then they can communicate with the IAC consultation team directly about the desire for funding for their own assessment project process as well. But what we've heard from participants in the webinars is that there's a ongoing desire from First Nations to exercise their inherent authority over lands, waters, and air. And in fact, I can use the word responsibility, right? The responsibility to care for the non-human world and be able to exercise authority over decisions that are made that impact First Nations land, waters, and air. And in a manner consistent with First Nations' own legal orders, customs, and traditions. First Nations need a clear process to decide whether to provide or withhold FPIC. I heard a lot of interest in learning more about existing or kind of past First Nations-led assessment processes, support for specific funding, and also that the Government of Canada needs to respect and implement First Nations decisions that come out of these First Nations-led assessment processes. In wanting to action the kind of desire for more information on First Nations-led assessments, I'm proposing that we host kind of part 2 to this webinar series. And so I've proposed a date of November 28th for a webinar specifically on First Nations-led assessments, and hoping to get folks from communities who have adopted their own processes and applied them to projects to come and speak to their experiences and provide any kind of lessons learned with anyone interested in receiving those. I've also reached out to a couple scholars who have kind of done research and compiled information on First Nations-led assessments. So far, we have confirmation from Erin Bruce, who is one of the members of the Circle of Experts who came to speak to the webinar last week on co-administration, has confirmed that he's interested in speaking about the Squamish Nations assessment process that he had been working on, as well as two scholars. So Dr. Nadine Scott from York University and a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia, Jeff Nishima Miller, who has put together kind of summaries of First Nations-led assessments. So really excited that those folks are available to come and share some recommendations with First Nations who are looking to adopt their own impact assessment processes, and hope that you all stay tuned and keep an eye out for information on registration for those sessions as well. Other kind of draft recommendations to action, call on the Government of Canada to allocate and provide funding to support the development of First Nations own assessment laws and procedures, and First Nations led assessments themselves, in addition to funding those kind of pilot projects that they've indicated that they're working on right now. I also think that at AFN, we could assist in kind of sharing lessons learned among First Nations by developing a working group of First Nations who representatives from First Nations who have adopted their own environmental assessment or impact assessment procedures and laws to share lessons in either webinars or other means, and potentially inform a toolkit for First Nations-led assessments if those don't. I know that there are some kind of pieces that exist elsewhere, but that's one of the things that I'm considering that we could do at AFN to help support First Nations who want to learn more about how to adopt their own processes to inform assessments. And also seek funding potentially to hold a meeting or workshop on First Nations-led assessments for next fiscal year, in addition to the webinars as well. Are there any kind of other things that folks think that we should be advocating kind of towards government or could be doing at the AFN level to support First Nations who want to perhaps develop their own environmental or impact assessment processes and apply them to projects in order to decide whether to provide or withhold free, prior, and informed consent, and also have those inform kind of government level impact assessment processes? We're really kind of keen to hear folks' suggestions on how we can support in that regard as well. If anyone wanted to raise their hand or put any thoughts in the chat before we move on to the project list piece. Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to the project list. How will our rules enforced? Carolyn says, how will our rules be enforced? So I think that's the other piece as well, is in other contexts, and I'm hoping that our guests in November can speak more to the details, but I do know that in other contexts, First to contracts with the proponent. I think in one case, at least, entered into a contract with the proponent themselves that said the proponent was going to fund the First Nations assessment process, and that the determination that the First Nations made to provide consent, and also I think for conditions, were going to be adhered to by the proponent. But those kinds of arrangements are voluntary on the part of proponents. And so where it does get trickier is where there's a determination made on the part of a First Nation, or perhaps conditions that they want placed on the project and the proponent. But the government, so the minister, hasn't necessarily adopted those kind of recommendations. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to learn to kind of hear from folks who have done this before on what are the mechanisms really to ensure that as Carolyn put it, rules, but I think also like decisions and potential conditions are enforced by government. So it's not necessarily something that I have an answer to right now, but hoping to kind of facilitate more dialogue to answer those questions exactly. I think just so it's case by case and there's no real enforcement mechanism. It's just enforcement of agreements. Yeah, I think my understanding is that at this point, that's the case, Carolyn, and looking to kind of identify recommendations that we could put forward for potentially amendments to the Act itself to ensure that it's not just on a case by case basis, that First Nations own assessments and determinations get listened to and enforced. for sure. So let's go on to the project list, because I know that there are folks on the line who are drafting submissions to the discussion paper on the 5-year review of the project list. So we heard that the regulation itself sets out classes of projects that are subject to impact assessment. IAC is the agency, sorry, is required to review the list 5 years after it was adopted and submit a report setting out conclusions and recommendations to the minister. So it is important to note that the discussion paper that's out for engagement right now, I think is intended to inform the agency's recommendations to the minister about what's on the project list and the thresholds that are employed, but nothing changes immediately. What comes next is that the agency will report to the minister, and then it's the minister who gets to decide what kind of changes are put forward in an amended regulation. We noted that there's a discussion paper that's released for feedback. One of the things that my colleague Graham had raised in the webinar is that the agency's lens for review is regulatory efficiency, but they didn't necessarily mention Indigenous rights or those minimum standards articulated in UNDRIP as a lens for the review. And the discussion paper itself doesn't acknowledge that those two kind of frames of how to discuss what can and should be on the list to receive federal impact assessment. It doesn't acknowledge that there's the potential for those to conflict, where, say, for example, First Nations have identified this class of project may potentially impact us and our rights. So we want it listed, but the agency, for because of the focus on like regulatory efficiency, has said no, we're going to take it off. Like there's not really any discussion in the discussion paper itself about how those two frames of reference can and do conflict. And so I think one of the things that we need to recommend is that the agency go back and do an assessment of how the addition or removal or changes to any kind of classes of projects and the thresholds that are on the list right now potentially impact First Nations, under the assumption that like when things receive a federal impact assessment, it's an opportunity for First Nations to have their voices heard regarding that project. And there's a requirement for consultation that's triggered. There's opportunities for partnership that First Nations might want to engage in and leverage, but if there's no assessment required, then that's a missed opportunity for First Nations to be involved. And so I think one of the recommendations that we will be making is that the agency take a pause on the review while they put together that like framework for analysis, the impact to First Nations, and provide First Nations an opportunity to engage with that analysis, because the only one I think that's available right now is this like lens for review of regulatory efficiency. We'll note too that First Nations took issue with the original approach to the project list and made many suggestions for project categories that should be included, but those haven't necessarily been adopted in the agency's discussion paper. The deck that I am referencing has like specifically sets out some information about certain classes of projects that the discussion paper has engaged with. I'll note, I think that the ones that I think we'll focus on in AFN's technical submission are nuclear project and in situ oil sands. I think most I don't want to say mostly because that's not necessarily the case, but I think the focus on those two categories of projects comes from our existing mandates. Our resolution from 2019 specifically calls for the inclusion of in situ oil sands operations and any nuclear projects on the project list so that they receive federal approval federal assessment. And so specifically the suggestion that in situ and nuclear projects would be removed from the project list is inconsistent with calls from First Nations going back as far as 20 or further than 2019. And I will just say as well for the in situ oil sands operations, the technical submission that we've been putting together from AFN, the recommendation is that if the suggestion from the agency is that they're going to remove those, they need to directly consult with First Nations in the oil sands region. They can't go and delist these projects without direct consultation with the potentially impacted First Nations. We'll just go to the what we heard slide. I think in the webinar, someone asked if the Impact Assessment Act interacts with the federal First Nation child welfare legislation. That's not a type of impact, or sorry, that's not a type of project. I think that is receives assessment, but it like impacts to First Nations children. Sorry, my phone's ringing. In undertaking like a First Nations led assessment, it is one of the things that is open to say, like, here's how this project is going to assess or impact potentially specifically children in our community, or our ability to exercise authority over like certain things within our community, including kind of the assertions of authority around child welfare, but it's not necessarily one of the things that we're talking about when we're talking about what's on the project list and therefore what receives federal assessment. Like I had mentioned, a concern about the lens used for review being regulatory efficiency and not potential impact to Indigenous rights. And I'll add to that, like First Nations ability to assert jurisdiction and authority over their territories as well, and a lack of information about how those viewpoints were engaged or weighted where they do or might conflict. We heard a general reflection that, and I alluded to it before, that removing classes of projects from the project list or increasing thresholds leads to fewer opportunities for First Nations to influence decision-making about projects in their territories. Specific concern with proposals regarding in situ oil sands production, nuclear, and SMRs, and a suggestion that there be stronger opportunities and requirements for regional assessments as well. I'll just go to, I'll kind of read the discussion questions that we have and some draft recommendations as well. And I see that we've got about half an hour. So I think maybe instead of going to, I have some AFN folks on the line, maybe instead of going to breakout sessions for a few things, maybe we'll just try the project list one and see how it goes. So one of the things that I think it would be important for folks to consider in deciding how you want to respond to the project list discussion paper is what kind of additional projects do you think should be included on the list due to potential impacts to First Nations rights? And are there new technologies or types of projects that you're concerned about? And I think specifically like something like carbon capture and storage hasn't currently received federal impact assessment. I know that there's an application by some First Nations to have a carbon capture and storage project designated for a federal impact assessment. Is that one of the things that we think should be on the list to receive a federal, assessment every time it is proposed? And I see Kim's comment in the chat, bring all the nuclear waste underground. So agreed. I do know that in terms of the nuclear and I forget the acronym, the long-term nuclear storage that is proposed. There's potentially 2 sites that the Nuclear Waste Management Organization is considering for like long-term disposal of nuclear. We've heard that it's their interpretation that they only have to do an impact assessment once a potential site is selected, like one of those 2, and there's a process for communities to vote on providing consent or not to the potential for the project to store nuclear waste. Anyway, so the NWMO has said, yes, we'll do an impact assessment once one of the 2 sites is selected. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that they have to pick a site before they do an assessment. It should be one of the requirements is to consider alternatives to a project, and I think alternative locations should be one of the things. And yeah, just note that Kim put in the chat that Kenora and Dryden already have blastomycosis, and that they can never abandon those burial sites. 2 different comments as well. There are some draft recommendations that we have we're considering and looking to put in our technical submission, and then perhaps we can kind of go to a few minutes and just try a breakout session to see if anybody wanted to discuss those additional projects that should be on the project list. But I'll just note that we've recommended that the agency articulate how Indigenous rights have been used as a lens to guide proposed changes, and that in situ oil sand facilities, fossil fuel power generating facilities, nuclear projects, and SMRs potentially impact First Nations rights and title. They should receive federal impact assessment. IAAC must consult with First Nations in the oil sands region before a determination can be made about whether to remove in situ oil sands operations, and prior to removing nuclear projects from the project list. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, which is the body that would do the impact assessment would still be responsible for the life cycle regulation of the project and other approvals if the impact assessment agency didn't have to do the impact assessment. Anyway, so prior to removing nuclear projects from the project list, the CNSC must meet or exceed the capacity and expertise of the agency in relation to Indigenous partnership, consultation, and engagement, and any protections and Indigenous specific considerations contained in the Impact Assessment Act should be incorporated into the regulatory framework administered by the CNSC. So basically, if the Government of Canada is going to rely on the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission to approve and oversee nuclear related projects, then they need to have the same expertise and capacity to consult towards free, prior, and informed consent than the agency has. And also the kind of ongoing recommendation, the reference to consideration of adverse effects on Indigenous peoples of Canada should be made mandatory in the Act itself. An evaluation of the potential for adverse projects effects should involve the active and informed participation of First Nations. In considering adverse impacts to First Nations rights, consultation with potentially affected First Nations must be mandatory. Abraham put a comment in the chat. Did I hear correctly that SMRs will be removed from the list? So that is the proposal from the agency. I'll just go back to my slide. So IAC has proposed to exempt single SMR proposals and increase thresholds for multiple SMRs. Alternatively remove all SMRs as well as large-scale nuclear reactors from using known technologies. IAC is also considering exempting or scoping down assessments of nuclear projects using known technologies on brownfield fossil fuel electricity generating sites. That's the summary of what they have suggested in the discussion paper on page 38. And I agree. Abraham's comment in the chat was, I don't know how to pronounce that word. I oppose this. Sorry, I very much oppose this is what I'm going to summarize the comment as, and really encourage you to provide a written submission in response to the discussion paper that says that exactly. So maybe we'll do.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
Well, we're talking about oil sands. Okay, so I don't know how many people are aware of this as well. So when we're going to be starting all these lithium projects across Canada right now, and this affects each and every province. So does everybody know that they will be using the brine from the oil in part of making all these products? And also, does everybody realize that they're going to be using their uranium? They're going to be using not just lithium. They'll be using sulfate. There'll be numerous magnesite, nickel, cobalt, that is more toxic than anything possible. So when we're complaining about the oil already and complaining about, hey, let's shut down the oil sands. Oil is not good, but let's go on to the lithium. That's better because down the line, once they make the products, it'll be better. Does everybody realize that trying to make these products and just getting them out of the ground is more toxic than the oil? Do people know about the air plumes, the water plumes in the air and how toxic that is? And lithium poisoning, cobalt poisoning, magnesite poisoning is a silent killer. So even those detectors that we wear, there's detectors that we have to put on when we go in places and those reactors and places like that detect if we're getting radiation poisoning. They don't even detect that. So if those machines aren't going to be detecting that, because it's a silent killer, we need to be on the ball about this as well, because the brine will be used from the oil as part of making all these products that will be made with lithium under the green energy belt or green project or whatever you guys want to call it, the green energy. This is not green energy. This is toxic energy. We had an issue with oil. We're fighting with oil, and now they want us to sign on to lithium. Are these people crazy? That's our duty, each and every one of us. We better be digging in. They ain't telling us about the lawsuits, and there's lots of lawsuits going on right now in Australia, the United States, all over. And the poisoning to the people and to the animals and to the lands is unreal. And that stuff for centuries cannot be reclaimed. Once it's poisoned, it's a goner, people. I hope everybody takes this into consideration.
Really important points, Kim. Thank you. And one of the, I'm not sure if everyone has seen the invitation for the National Climate Gathering. One of the things that AFN has been doing over the last number of years is coordinating a National Climate Gathering. We held the first one in Whitehorse, Yukon, I believe 4 years ago. And there was another in Halifax 2 years ago. There will be a climate gathering in October. It's the week of October 7th. in Calgary. One of the concurrent sessions that I've been helping to organize is about First Nations leadership in the energy transition. And one of the things that we're hoping to, thank you, Marianne, for putting the link in the chat for the climate gathering. One of the concurrent sessions that I've been helping to organize is about First Nations leadership in the energy transition. And one of the things that we're looking to highlight and the points that we're hoping to make is that any project needs to receive First Nations consent if it's on a First Nations territory. It can't, projects can't be like subvert that requirement because they're labeled as a green project, right? And one of the examples that we'll have folks speaking to is the construction of an electric vehicle battery recycling and manufacturing facility. There's one of those facilities that's proposed for the South Shore of Montreal in Mohawk territory, and the Mohawk Council of Kahnawake has initiated a lawsuit against the Northvolt plant. And so the portfolio chief from Kahnawake will be there to speak about that situation as well. And it's a case where the lithium that is potentially mined elsewhere in Canada will be used to manufacture batteries, but the facility itself didn't receive a provincial environmental assessment and didn't receive consent from the local First Nations who have a responsibility to protect the land on which it's proposed as well. So hoping to facilitate that conversation. And
Anybody from BC out there too? Because Victoria Island has a massive, and they're going to be producing the biggest plant in Canada on Native territories and lands.
I haven't reached out to them in particular, but if you have any contacts, Kim, I'd love to follow up with you offline on that.
I've got researchers like you would not believe. And like I said, I know each and every reserve involved, clean across Canada. I know what province is digging what minerals, how toxic those are. I've got environmentalist people from across the world that give me all kinds of information, and there's many of us. And we've been trying to wake up the people at each reserve, off and on reserve, that, hey, we better be waking up here. We have a big job ahead of us, because they're telling us the green energy is better. Green energy is about to kill us all. And I'm not pleased and I'm not happy with this. We've been lied to. And when you try to approach chief and band councils, we are shunned. They go after us. They run us off the roads. They send people to try to assault us. I know lots of individuals that have this as happening, even lawyers that are trying to help us put these cases together to wake up our own nation, to tell them, hey, what the hell are you people doing? Of course, they're going to come and say, oh, yeah, we're giving you this, giving you that. This is very serious what we're about to go on doing here. And that's our job and duty, each and every one of us, members to the lands, that we have to know this. And a lot of people are unaware of this, how toxic this is. But I've got maps, and there's lots of people that have them.
Thank you, Kim. Really important points. I see in the chat a comment from Lauren. I'm concerned that the exemptions means that First Nations don't even get notified of proposed projects. And yeah, I mean, I share your concern for sure. So I think the kind of assumptions that we're operating under is that a federal impact assessment is an opportunity for First Nations to be notified of projects, be consulted on projects, and also partner with the agency in like assessment, but hopefully approval of the projects as well through various means of doing so. If the project doesn't receive a federal impact assessment, it could still potentially receive a provincial assessment or territorial assessment in some cases. But we know that there's kind of varying standards throughout the country based on the provincial environmental assessment legislation. And so it doesn't provide, or it means that First Nations throughout the country might find themselves in various different kind of circumstances based on their relationship with the provincial government, and that's not necessarily acceptable when the First Nations like nation to nation relationship is with the federal crown, right? And so one of the things that we've been advocating is that it's the responsibility of the federal government in thinking about substitution specifically with any federal assessment to a provincial assessment. They need to make sure that the provincial process and standards meet the federal one, and that there's equal protections for First Nations and opportunities to be consulted and partner if they're going to look to provincial assessments. And I think one of the things that we are concerned about coming out of the amendments that were adopted in response to the Supreme Court decisions is there seems to be like more opportunity to defer and substitute for provincial like regulatory decision-making process in addition to assessments. And so we need to continue to articulate this expectation that the federal government won't defer to provincial assessment or other kind of approval processes if they don't provide the same opportunities for First Nations. So I would encourage you to continue to make that point as well. I do see we've got about 20 minutes left, so maybe instead of going to breakouts, and sorry for the shift here, but we're rolling with what we've got. And I really appreciate everyone's intervention, so I want to make space for those. Maybe we'll just go to quickly talk about what we heard in terms of the ministerial exclusion order. And so on this topic, we understand that for environmental assessments on what is defined as federal lands, but includes reserves, there's a special process. And so ISK has adopted their environmental effects determination. ISK, the Indigenous Service Canada, has their environmental review process. One of the pieces that the agency is engaging on is a regulation that sets a list of things that they've considered are small projects and therefore don't require or wouldn't require an environmental effects determination. And we've shared the link to what's called the Canada Gazette, where you could see the proposed changes, but I will share that again. I can put the link in the chat. One of the interesting things that we heard from the ISK presenters is that they're doing a review of their environmental review process. And so they haven't necessarily released anything specific for comment, but it is really interesting just to note that that ISK itself is reviewing its environmental review process, and they're open to receiving recommendations from folks who have experience with that. The kinds of projects that we've seen require an environmental review from ISK are like housing developments, potentially like cultural centers, like on First Nations reserves. What we heard from webinar participants is a concern for how the potential for cumulative effects has driven the proposal for what should get exempted from the environmental effects determinations. I heard from folks that we're kind of at critical tipping points for a lot of our ecosystems and landscapes, and any potential impact adds to a multitude of impacts that are kind of affecting the landscape, and so none can be considered negligible at this point. For folks on the line, is there anyone that has experience with ISK's environmental review process that would like to connect with the folks that are reviewing those requirements? Or really take issue with anything that you've experienced in that regard. And I'd be happy to kind of connect you to the right folks if you haven't been able to make those connections already. And also just hear from anyone if you're concerned with any of the specific projects that IAC proposes to exempt from the environmental effects determinations. And I'll note too that there are some proposals for what could be exempted in protected areas that are managed by Parks Canada and national wildlife areas as well. So this, I think there was like general concerns, I think, about cumulative effects, but we didn't hear a lot of specific, like yes or no, we think that you should be making those changes. But if folks have those recommendations to make, I'd be happy to follow up offline as well. I'll just go to our draft recommendation. So one of the things that we could do at the AFN level is circulate a questionnaire about First Nations experiences with the environmental review process as a way to like identify folks who potentially have issues that they'd like to raise with it. We haven't actioned that yet, but would be happy to kind of hear from folks if you think that would be useful. We could engage directly with ISK to provide recommendations on their environmental review processes. Again, haven't necessarily actioned that recommendation at all, but happy to hear if you think that's something that AFN should be doing. And also, I think calling on the federal government to invest in First Nation flood follow-up and monitoring to ensure that projects that have been exempted from environmental reviews actually don't end up having unintended consequences. And I think Kim had raised the point about kind of unintended or unforeseen consequences of projects. One of the things that we heard from the agency is that these like small, what they've deemed as small projects don't receive assessment, or they don't require the environmental review process assessment. And the point was raised, well, what if they end up being bigger than you say they were going to be? They were exempted because they were small, but then they end up being bigger, or they end up having an impact on a water body where that was one of the conditions of the exemption is that they didn't. How do you follow up with those? And I see Abraham's note in the chat supporting that third recommendation there, but indicating my only struggle with it comes back to the capacity issue, and sometimes huge data gaps are present. So how do First Nations track, say, the water level in a water body? The requirement for exemption was that the project wasn't going to impact the water level. If a project goes ahead and is constructed, how do we identify whether the water level did or did not rise if we don't have the baseline data? And I think it's a really important point is that investment needs to be made upfront to identify environmental baselines on a timeline that First Nations have identified, and that takes time. And so the investment can't just be made in monitoring. There needs to be like sustained kind of relationships that support that kind of environmental monitoring. So be happy to hear if anyone else has any kind of feedback on those recommendations, and I'll just pause there for a second if anyone else wanted to intervene.
Well, let's see. For 1 ton of lithium, up to 2 million liters of water is required. Imagine that. And as they start going down the processing plant, that's only for one product, lithium. And as they start doing the processing from stage 1, 2, 3, the amount of water that needs to be used as well. Massive, massive, massive amounts of water need to be used. And if those aquifers are like the veins underground of water, the veins. And once those things get damaged, we're poisoned. That stuff leaking. I don't know if people are aware of how much water needs to be used. Just drilling those minerals out of the water or out of the ground, the amount of water that needs to be used, never mind once they start processing, how much water needs to be done. They're also going to be going to every town and hamlet and city because they need, towards the end of it, they have to have like a special kind of cleansed water. So guess where that goes? Those are hooked to all the towns, the cities, the hamlets, the human consumption water treatment plants. We have to wash with that water. We have to clean our clothes with that water. We feed our animals that water. People drink that water. Even boiling it's not going to clean it out. I don't know how many people have looked into this, but it's serious, and there's big lawsuits all over the place, and they make sure that we're not aware of those things. I know with my personal reserve, I tried to speak to my chief numerous times with regards to this. I tried to ask him if he knew about these. I provided him information, and I was just brushed under the rug. It's not important. They have their own way. Well, he may not be worried about himself getting poisoned or his kids or grandkids, but I know I am. I don't want the elders. I don't want the people not only on the reserve, but the communities around. I don't want those people sick. I can't walk around and look at a child or an elder knowing that they're getting poisoned.
Thank you, Kim. Really important points.
Actually, here, another one I have for you guys. Every ton mine results in over 15 tons of CO2 emissions. 500 million liters of water is needed to mine approximately 2.2 million liters of petroleum of lithium, which impacts the environment and leading to water scarcity in already our rigid areas. Lithium leads to people getting brain damage, coma, all your muscular system starts breaking down. Everybody gets cancer. You can bleed from the eyeballs, long-term kidney and neurological problems from the air plumes. Even the guys that are mining is pluming it when they got to transport that stuff into those canisters that they want to be burying in the ground. Once they get to a plant, that can't even be people that touch that. That's got to be like machinery that's got to touch and move those canisters. This is really toxic stuff they're going to be dealing with. Very toxic. And water is life. Without water, we have nothing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kim. And I see a comment in the chat. Thanks, Marianne, for copying it so into the public chat there. But from Kim, building on Lauren and Jennifer's previous comments, it says we don't because chief and councils do not tell us and give us full disclosure, and no one puts it out publicly. So I think the concern there from Kim being that community members aren't receiving information from leadership about potential impacts to the community themselves, which I think is a ongoing concern. And I think definitely one of the things that could be in part addressed by calls and fulfillment of calls for enhanced capacity as well for that communication piece.
That's even for the projects to know that are coming up or what they're wanting.
Oh yeah,
getting ready to do. They don't let anybody know.
right.
They don't let any of the members know. They don't even let like the people in the community know that until like, you know what I mean? Their deals and paperwork is already signed. And that's when it seems like the public is, you know what I mean? There'll be something published publicly, but by that time, people have already went and signed paperwork and deals. And then look at, where do we get money? I guarantee 99% of us on this here, how many of you can get the money to go pay a lawyer to start a lawsuit right now? None of us can. And
Absolutely.
once they start signing those deals and paperwork and make arrangements, and then they're even going now and doing joint ventures with people to open up companies that to say, okay, well, we're going to have environmental group open up a joint venture with the reserve, which is all hooked with the federal government. Everybody's taking loans from the federal government. That's what's going on. And then they wait to the last minute to let us know. And then it's too late, because none of us, how do we get into the courts, provincial courts, federal courts? It's just a constant runaround. That's why I said we have to join forces across. We can't just say I'm from Kahnawake and the Mohawk Nation, and then I'm an Ojibwe Cree guy from the Robinson Superior, and then I'm a Cree guy from Treaty 4, and I'm a Secwepemc guy from BC, and we only worry about our area. Each and every one of us have a duty to work together and join forces. The more of us that stand united across our country, we're going to be heard. But when we break into these individual groups and say, well, I can only work over here and worry about my nation and territory in this section, this is how we're not getting nowhere. We take one step forward and 50 steps backwards. We have to start all working together, all of us, and we have to represent our country. We have to put this business, well, this guy has a status card. This guy didn't get a status card. This guy over here belongs to the Asma Nation. This guy belongs to the people of the Salmon. This guy over here is a half-breed. We have to put that all aside. Each and every one of us, when you cut us, we all bleed the same. We all need to eat. If somebody took a rock and hit each and every one of us on the head, we're all going to get a prune and a cut, and it's going to hurt. And that's how we need to all look at each other. We're all equal, no matter what color skin we are, no matter what province we come from, what nation we come from. And us as the native people, the Indians, and that's the way it is in this country. The people here that are not Indian people are the native people. And it's written in the treaties. It don't matter if you're a black guy, you're the native guy to Canada. And we have a duty. We have a duty with our treaties that all our ancestors that signed. They didn't just sign those treaties to say, we'll only cover this certain people. That meant all of us, each and every one of us. And we have that duty. We have to work together, all of us, and make them accountable. We have to make our chiefs and band councils accountable, because we all know that chief and band councils work for the government. This is what I tell people. We have one chief and one band council of Canada. And right now that's the Liberal government. Justin Trudeau is the head chief and his caucus is the head council. And then each and every reserve across Canada has a chief and band council, and they work for the chief and band council of Canada. They don't work for the people or us guys that are on the reserve. And all the off reserve, 99% of us are all off reserve. But yet every month they get money for us off reserve people. But yet when the crap hits the fan, it's us guys that got to clean up the mess.
Thank you, Kim. I'm just conscious of time. I don't mean to cut you off. I think that the chats that are agreeing with you, and I really hope that we're able to kind of facilitate some of the follow-up conversations. There's some folks in the chat who are saying agree and supporting the comments you've been making. So really happy to be able to facilitate that conversation. We do have an opportunity to kind of help this conversation go along with those so I'm going to say working group. That's not the right word. I'd like to try and put together like a network of folks who are working on impact assessment related issues. And so one of the things that I'll be doing is reaching out to all of the folks who were registered for the webinars and kind of gauging interest. So please stay tuned for that as well, to kind of continue the dialogue that we've been having over the last 5 webinars, and hopefully pick up in November for some more as well. I will just say before we go to Elder Verna for closing, one of the kind of interesting things I'm actually going to continue sharing my screen. I think it was stopped for a second. But one of the interesting things that we heard from the agency was that community members can comment on environmental reviews for projects on reserve through the online system. And the online system that they were referring to is the Canadian Impact Assessment Registry. I don't think there's a lot of people who know that this is the tool that they're supposed to use. I certainly wouldn't if I wasn't doing this job, right? So the registry itself was updated after in 2019 when the new act was adopted to set out requirements for what needs to be on the registry. And you can actually sign up to receive notifications about certain kinds of projects. And so I'd be happy if anyone's interested to connect you to the folks who can help you, like with the search requirements, identify what search like priorities you have to be identified about certain impact assessments or like requests for designation. But I think this is one tool that folks could use if you're interested in that. And like receiving information about ongoing projects. So I'll stop sharing that. And with that, I think we'll close for our session today. I do hope to continue webinars because I think that we've received a lot of good feedback from folks and really appreciate all of the input that folks have shared throughout the series and today as well. And so we'll be looking to host another kind of part 2 starting in November and hopefully into the new year as well. So with that, we'll go to Elder Berna and have us close in a good way.
Oh, thank you, Andrea. Miigwech, everybody. You know, it's almost like I logged on 10 minutes ago here and it's like we're having concurrent discussions. I'm here at the Shadow Log with some elders and community members and talking about how do you save the American eel was one of the questions. And yes, they got caught up in the turbines in the dams, but also too as well the contamination of them. And and I always say that too, what we do to the earth, we do to ourselves because it eventually comes back to us because water connects all of us. And why I do these two as well and do closing prayer ceremony too is I'll just tell you a real quick story. One Friday, I was asked, my son and I, to go with Elder William Commanda, and he was going up to Charbet Lake because they were protesting the uranium mining. Uranium, when I was listening to, is similar to lithium. For us too, we have uranium, naturally occurring uranium. We only found out in 92 in our community. So a lot of community members have kidney issues and other issues. And but also too as well, even low level radiation, I wonder sometime now contributes to this fertility. And we're facing a fertility crisis now too. So, and it was foretold that too as well, that it would be the Red Earth people to stand up and to remind the other colors of people that we're all here and we all share this earth. We all share the water, the air, the fire from the sun shines on us equally, and the earth. And so that's why also though, but we always forget the spirit. Going back to this uranium mine, what happened is in Charbet Lake with Elder William, I had a dream. I had a dream about the car industry. And I got this concept and I wrote it down. Then I did a little research and I put a little paper together, but I didn't know who to send it to. And again, I had a dream, and the dream was that this person I knew came into my dream, and I said, why am I dreaming about this person? And then for some reason, I woke up and I opened the New York Times and they had the full page spread on this person. who was the chairman for the Center for Automotive Research. And I said, oh, that's a guy I need to send my idea to, or concept that I got. And it went to him. But it also, because this car crisis was in trouble. And so then it sort of came around like, what do you want in return? And I said, really, nothing. But I said, but there are people that are being thrown in jail and with this uranium mine because it's open pit and it will go in the water and in the air. And so sure enough, what happened though is the project never proceeded. And I think that's spirit too. And I was talking to this, I forget her, Ghostface, Kim Ghostface in the Navajo Nation. And she said that sometimes, because we had no resources for legal, so what did we do? We did ceremony for this other mine in the Navajo land. And she said, and all of a sudden, the mine or the project was canceled. So sometimes too, it's not to forget to ask our ancestors and spirit for guidance to and assistance. And so, yeah, it's a great mystery, but again, too, it's for the benefit of our future generations. So I say, miigwech, o jeni gash kitocha mo and dose koshe nom gom, shuen mishnon in abigis, we do kwa kakina, pomatsa jiktan as well koshe, miigwech on kakina gagishan dan onje, gagishan dan kakina, gijemonedo, kin to the bend on kakina, kin ke mojo on kakina, we do kwa kakina, pomatsa jik, on jail dumpto in a shitchia kakina, we do done hen abigis. We do kwa kakina mia miigwech, 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 miigwech. Again, miigwech for everything. And yeah, I think it's good discussions, and it's good for us to come together and putting questions forward, because really too, we're in times too where, as the elders say too as well, water will be like gold, and not everybody will have the right to drink safe water. And they predicted that there'll be wars over water. And if you look at what they're doing overseas too, they're bombing, but at the same time, what are they doing to the land? And that's why you send prayers to for peace, and because we need to coexist. But again, it was up to the red people too to remind the other nations, other nations on this earth, of what our responsibility is. So miigwech everybody, and keep up the good work, I think. So yeah, you're free
Miigwech,
to
Elder
go.
Berna.
Oh, thank you, Andrea.
Miigwech. Thank you, everyone. Take care.